I'm worried about the middle class of this country. The government has destroyed, and I use that word in the past tense, destroyed the middle class of the USA. The Fed calls having a fiat currency a tool. Now, I want to ask you, did you ever vote on not backing the US dollar with anything? Did that ever come up for a vote in 1971? Did your dad or your grandpa say, you know what, I think it's a great idea to back the US dollar with absolutely nothing? No, it's a rhetorical question. So the Fed has been able to print away every bear market and every recession since 1987. And that has eventually engendered asset bubbles and debt levels that are just, unserviceable and untenable. And when you think about it, there's 12 voting members of the Federal Open Market Committee. 12. Do you think that was by accident? I don't think so. I think they try to imitate that, they're somehow similar to the 12 apostles, and they become like demigods. And they want us to parse Fed statements like we're reading scripture. And let me tell you something, my friend, they're not omniscient. What they really are, in my opinion, is a bunch of feckless politicians. And maybe they're not nefarious in nature, but they're egomaniacs seeking power by any means necessary, holding on to that power. And now, because they've printed away every recession and every bear market, they're now compelled to keep inflation rising to prevent asset bubbles from imploding. They have no other choice, because if they let asset bubbles implode and debt deflation to occur now, it wouldn't be a recession, it would be a depression that we would enter. And they're doing their best to make the government appear solvent, even though it is in fact insolvent. So now they're claiming inflation, and this is the punchline here, they're claiming inflation is quiescent and monetary policy is tight, even though, and let me give you a list of things that are just counterintuitive to that notion. Credit spreads are tight and they're getting tighter. Financial conditions are easy and they're getting easier. Inflation's above the Fed's 2% target, and that's their warped definition of stable prices. Stable prices in my mind and everybody else's mind would be zero. In the Fed's mind, inflation being stable is 2% inflation, and it's heading further north. So in March, inflation was 3.2% headline CPI, and now it's 3.5%. And here's the thing, the Fed said that they wanted to get back to 2% inflation as fast as possible. But in March marked 3 years of inflation way above the 2% target. Commodity prices, there are 19 commodities in the CRB index. That index alone rose 6% in March. The Wall Street Journal says that food prices are up 37% in the last 4 years, 37%. Buying a home has become unaffordable. Inflation has wiped out the middle class. 78% of Americans now polled say they're living paycheck to paycheck. Yet in this scenario, the Federal Reserve says, hey, everything's good with the monetary policy, and we have to start cutting interest rates and end QT as fast as humanly possible. We're cutting in half, probably starting in March. And the question you should be asking me next is why? Why in the world, given all those facts that I just said, would the Fed seek to bolster the rate of inflation when they're wiping out, or maybe indeed have wiped out, the middle class of America? Because the vast swath of bank, consumer, business, and government debt is unserviceable and untenable at 5% plus borrowing costs. So Powell is pooping his pants right now to get borrowing costs down as fast as he possibly can, because the economy is cycling these debt levels at much higher interest rates, and it just doesn't work. That's the truth. I look at something called risk premium. So if you take the inverse of the PE ratio, that means the earnings yield of stocks, right? That gives you an earnings yield of around 4.7, 4.8%. But I can get 5.3% in a risk-free T-bill. So another way of saying is that you're getting paid more by owning a risk-free T-bill than you are in buying stocks. This is very rare. The last time this happened was 2002, I believe. So this is a very rare event where the risk premium for stocks is negative. So and that's using their ultra optimistic forward guess on earnings. It still isn't worth it. That's why I have 60% of my portfolio is in what they call risk-free short-term treasury bonds, treasury notes to be specific, not really T-bills, but notes. So I'm out in the 1 to 3 year treasury note. How much debt really is out there? So it drives me crazy. I still hear people on mainstream financial media talk about how wonderful the consumer is doing and the consumer has no debt, blah, 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 blah. Consumer debt is at an all-time record high. There's $20 trillion of consumer debt. That's up from $15.6 trillion in 2019. 40% of the Russell 2000 is unprofitable. Corporate debt is now $13.7 trillion, up 100% since 2007. Record 49% of GDP. Corporate defaults have soared by 80% since 2023. $1.8 trillion have to be refinanced by 2025. There's a record $1.3 trillion of credit card debt. Delinquencies up 100% since 2021. Highest on record. Auto loan delinquencies are the highest in a decade. And as I mentioned before, 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Now, I'm creating a scenario to show you how much debt there is outstanding and why it's just not serviceable. It may be at 0.3% when the 10-year note was 0.3, but not at 5.25. So private credit, which are loans to businesses who can't get a loan from a bank or issue corporate debt, that was $100 billion pre the global financial crisis. Now it's $1.7 trillion. The government has $1 trillion in interest payments in 2025. In 2007, the total debt was $160 billion. Now we're paying $1 trillion just in interest payment. Of course, we know it's 123.5% total debt to GDP. It was 60% of GDP in the global financial crisis. The national debt is 733% of our revenue, and we're adding to that over 40% every year because of our debt and deficit. A fifth of all of our revenue is spent on interest payment. These are all facts I'm giving you. Powell, and he's out there doing this shtick. He's like, inflation's coming down, but it's going to be bumpy and lumpy and schmumpy. No, Powell, inflation isn't coming down. It's been above 2% for 3 years. It's going higher away from 2%, and it's going away from 2% at a faster rate. So how much longer are you going to lie about this? Here's where the rubber meets the road, because I manage money for a living. You're lying about this in the hopes that someday, soon, you're going to get your wish. You can say, oh, he'll get this great inflation print. Wow, we're closer to 2%. I can start cutting rates. But at 3.5% headline CPI, and with home prices out of reach and asset prices at record levels, how much do you think he's going to be able to cut before he, sends the dollar crashing and inflation up even further? And there's one more thing I just have to mention. There's a good chance, this is the first time really since 1981 that the Fed's going to be cutting rates when we have an inflation problem. What happens if they cut rates and end QT and go back into QE and restart the bank term funding program and maybe get rid of the reserve requirement, the capital ratio requirement for banks? What if they do all this stuff and guess what? Long-term rates soar. They've solved nothing. You're talking about mass bankruptcies in corporate America and mass bankruptcies on the consumer level, and the government being insolvent if they were to pursue a policy of higher for longer. They really wanted to get inflation down to 2% and keep it there. I think they risk having a depression, not a recession. I think Powell, at best, as I said, he's not omniscient by any means. He's a feckless politician. He's in the charge of keeping banks solvent, or trying to make them as solvent as possible, or appear that way, and by de facto measure also the government. So I think he's going to be able to cut rates at best once before the election. He will cut QT, the pace in QT, in half as well. And that's my prediction. I think that is going to be woefully inadequate to stop the recession from coming. And I think we're going to have an air pocket sometime around whenever the reverse repo facility money is withdrawn. We have about $400 billion left there. That's QE, which is offsetting the QT, and then some by about $500 billion in the past year. And when that happens, you're going to have a problem in the repo market. We're going to keep cycling these interest rates through the banking system and through consumers and through corporations. And I think you end up with an air pocket in asset prices sometime in the summer. It's going to start out as a disinflationary recession, in my opinion, and end up as a stagflationary recession in response to what the Fed is going to do. By the way, we already had a recession in manufacturing and in S&P 500 earnings, in most asset prices, stock and bonds. So manufacturing sector contracted for 16 out of the last 17 months. We had 4 straight quarters of year-over-year earnings growth that was negative. And the Russell 2000 fell by 35% from the end of 21 to October of 23. So we've already had had a recession, but we're going to have another one. We're still headed for another recession, or part two of the recession that started in 2022 and end of 21, 22. Gross domestic income plummeted, by the way, in 2022. I think it's going to be a truncated recession. It will be combated by measures that Powell will take as far as slashing the Fed funds rate back towards zero, below 2%, in my opinion. He will relaunch the Bank Term Funding Program. I don't think the standing repo facility or the discount window is going to be enough to ameliorate the plunge in asset prices, in particular commercial real estate and mortgage-backed securities. So I'm predicting a truncated recession.